The horse's hooves struck the hard earth in a steady beat, dust lifting in golden clouds, as Russell followed the narrow trail that twisted through cottonwoods and mesquite. Evening weighed heavy, the sky streaked with violet as cicadas droned, their steady song. He had ridden this path countless times before, always without meaning, always in silence, but tonight the quiet broke, cut by a sound sharp and fragile, carried across the heat of the fading day. A child's cry. Russell reined in, his heart thudding once, twice. At first he thought it must be a calf lost from its mother, but the sound wavered, filled with words, thin and desperate. "Mama, please." The plea scraped the silence like rusted metal. Swinging down from his saddle, Russell's boots crunched over brittle grass as he followed the cry. In the clearing, the sight rooted him in place. A woman lay collapsed in the dirt, her face turned to the dimming light, her body battered and bruised until she seemed hardly alive. Her dress was torn, stained with blood and dust, one arm twisted beneath her. Clinging to her side was a girl no older than 6, hair tangled, cheeks wet with tears, her small arms wrapped tightly around her mother. At the sound of his approach, the child's wide eyes lifted, storm grey, full of fear. She pressed herself closer against the woman's ribs, as if her tiny frame could shield her mother from harm. "Don't hurt her more," the girl gasped. Her voice trembled, but her grip held firm. "Mama's been beaten too many times, she won't ever heal." Russell's throat constricted. He had seen cruelty before. Horses whipped, wives shrinking under their husbands' hands, but this felt heavier, cutting through the defenses he had carried for years. Slowly he lowered himself to the ground, meeting them at eye level, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. "Easy," he murmured, voice rough but gentle. "I won't harm you." The child studied him, suspicion tightening her lips. She shook her head, whispering, "That's what they all said." Russell kept his hands open at his sides, dust clinging to his sweat. The weight of the gun at his hip was a reminder of what men always bore, but he made no move toward it. His gaze shifted back to the woman. Her breaths came shallow and faint. Each breath came shallow, fragile. A dark bruise marked her jaw, and her lips were cracked from thirst. Life remained faint but present, like the last ember in a dying fire. He reached carefully for her wrist. The girl flinched but didn't resist. His fingers pressed lightly against her pulse, weak yet steady. Relief loosened his chest, though its meaning weighed heavily. She was still alive. Who did this? He asked quietly. Her lower lip trembled. "The settlers. They said Mama owed them. Papa's gone. They hurt her and left her here." Her voice broke into sobs, her small frame shaking. Inside Russell, something stirred, unwanted, unwelcome. The ache of pity and the heavier ache of duty. He wanted to turn away, as the world often taught men to do, but the image of the child clinging to her mother's hands refused to leave him. Silence stretched, broken only by his heartbeat and a hawk's distant cry from the trees. "I can't leave you here," he murmured, more to himself than to them. The child looked up. "You'll take her. You'll be gentle." Her plea cut deeper than any demand. Russell gave a firm nod. "I'll be careful every step." With practiced care and a trace of hidden tenderness, he lifted the woman's frail body. She stirred faintly, a weak sound escaping her dry lips, but she did not wake. Russell rose slowly, her weight light yet burdened with meaning beyond flesh and bone. The girl hurried after him, clutching his coat as if he might vanish. When they reached the horse, the animal shifted uneasily, sensing the change. Russell whispered a low command, calming it. He settled the woman onto the saddle before him, her head resting against his shoulder. The child climbed up next, wedging herself between her mother and him, small hands gripping the reins though she could not steer. The sun sank lower, spilling crimson across the horizon, outlining their figures in sharp relief. Russell tightened his hold, steadying both mother and daughter, the weight pressing on his chest was not from carrying them, but from the certainty that his life, once marked by silence and solitude, was no longer the same. The path stretched ahead, darker now, shadows lengthening across the land. The cicadas had gone quiet, leaving only hoofbeats and the uneven breathing of the woman resting against him. The girl pressed against his side, silent now, though her tears dampened his coat. Russell's gaze stretched over the horizon. The road back was long, the risks many. Yet his certainty was firm. He would not abandon them, not here, not anywhere. Whatever burdens or debts had driven them to this point, whatever judgment others might pass, he had taken responsibility for them. He urged the horse forward, each step steady over the uneven ground. Above, the first stars broke through the fading light, scattered like distant sparks. Behind them, the land lay hushed, carrying the memory of cruelty and violence. Ahead, uncertainty waited, heavy with tomorrow's demands. Still, with the girl gripping his coat and the woman resting weakly against his chest, Russell felt his own resolve anchor firmly. He would be careful. He would not allow them to be harmed again. The night gathered around them, shadows folding in as the horse carried them forward. Somewhere beyond the darkened hills, new threats lingered. But for now, the trail was theirs, alone. In the quiet of that ride, Russell sensed the West itself had shifted, pulling him towards something he could not yet name, but could no longer turn away from. The cabin stood at the prairie's far edge, weathered by years of wind and sun, its roofline leaning as though tired of standing alone. Russell dismounted slowly, the horse's breath rising in the cool twilight, and lifted the injured woman from the saddle. She stirred faintly, a low sound escaping her lips, though her eyes stayed closed. The little girl still held tight to his coat as he carried her mother inside, the dim interior closing around them. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin. The hearth lay cold. Faint grey ash settled within. Dust swirled in the last shaft of evening light that entered through a small window. Russell set the woman down on his narrow bed, his jaw tightening as he saw the extent of her injuries. Dark. Bruises spread along her neck and arms. Welts marked her back where fabric had torn away, and her breathing came shallow and uneven. It wasn't the sight of blood that made him pause. He had seen that often in saloons and cattle drives, but the quiet dignity of someone who had been reduced to nothing. The girl stood at the bed's edge, fists clenched, watching him closely, as if waiting for him to falter, waiting for him to send them away like so many before. He met her gaze without looking away, then crossed to gather firewood from the corner. Soon, a flame sparked to life, shadows shifting along the log walls. Heat began to spread through the room, easing the sharp cold that had followed them inside. "Hand me that tin cup," Russell said softly. His voice was coarse, yet the girl hurried to the shelf and returned with it, holding it carefully in both hands. He filled it with water from the barrel, dampened a cloth, and began gently wiping the dirt and blood from the woman's face. She twitched at his touch, her lashes flickering but did not wake. Leaning closer, the girl whispered, "Her name is Isidora." Her tone trembled, but there was pride in it, as if speaking the name aloud protected something no cruelty could erase. Russell gave a small nod. Isidora. The name carried a quiet sorrow, though spoken tenderly. "She'll stay here tonight." For the first time since he had found her, the child's guarded expression softened. She climbed into the chair near the fire, her legs dangling above the floor. The flames cast a warm glow across her thin face, showing hollow cheeks and eyes, far older than her years. She hugged a worn doll against her chest, rocking slightly as though seeking comfort. Outside, the wind carried faint laughter drifting from the town, not far enough to bury the memory of what had been done. The sound crawled under Russell's skin. He knew those voices, the kind that mocked the weak, that pressed boots down simply because they could. Once he had stood too near men like that and stayed silent. But silence no longer sat well with him. When the girl finally nodded off, Russell stepped outside. The prairie stretched open, shadows long across the grass as stars broke across the sky. Leaning against the porch post, he scanned the horizon. Somewhere beyond the hills, the men responsible still drank and slept easily, believing no consequence would reach them. His jaw set firm, though no words escaped. The West had its own law, slow, quiet, often unforgiving. He knew better than to cry out against it. Instead, he made his vow in silence, one only the night would witness. No hand would harm that woman again. Inside, Isidora stirred at last. Her eyes opened slightly, unfocused, lips dry and cracked. She looked at him with confusion, then at the room as though it were strange and unwelcome. Her voice broke, faint as a breath. "Why? Why here?" Russell crouched beside her bed. "Because the earth was no place for you." She shut her eyes again as if ashamed. "You shouldn't have brought me. I'm only trouble. They'll come for me, for her." Her words faded into shallow breaths. Russell laid the damp cloth gently on her forehead. "Rest. We'll speak later." All through the night, he kept the fire alive, feeding it carefully with wood, listening to the uneven rhythm of her breathing. Nora shifted in her chair, whispering in her sleep, once calling out before curling tighter around the doll. Russell remained alert, hat pulled low, eyes tracing the flickering shadows cast by the fire. With dawn, pale light seeped through the cracks in the boards. Isidora had slipped back into unconsciousness, though her complexion looked slightly less pale. Nora stirred awake, stiff and quiet, rubbing her eyes. Russell passed her a tin plate with bread and dried apple, the best he could offer. She murmured, "Thanks," before eating silently, her gaze fixed on her mother. Later that day, Russell led the horse to water and fed it oats, his mind unsettled. Though no neighbor had yet crossed his land, he already sensed judgment in the air. It felt as though whispers drifted like smoke, eyes watching from across fences, questioning why he had taken in the battered woman and her child. Out here, debts were rarely forgiven, and compassion for abandoned women was even scarcer. That evening, he rode into town for supplies. The saloon door groaned behind him, conversations faltering. Men looked up from their tables, women from their chairs, eyes narrowing. Russell walked directly to the counter, purchased flour and salt, and spoke little. As he turned to leave, a voice followed him, low, mocking, edged with warning. "Reckon the cowboy's taken in a stray." Laughter rippled through the room. "Careful, Russell. That kind of trouble don't wash clean." He kept his pace steady, not turning back, though inside his chest a slow fire burned. By the time he returned to the cabin, darkness had fallen. Nora sat by the fire, waiting. She looked up when he entered, searching his face for news of the world beyond. He met her gaze, calm and steady, and gave a single nod. She seemed to draw courage from it, then turned back to her mother's side. Russell set down the supplies, drew his chair closer to the bed, and sat. Isidora breathed faintly, her face slack with exhaustion, her hands resting open on the quilt. The girl curled on the floor beside her, unwilling to sleep apart. The cabin was quiet, broken only by the fire's whisper. Yet beneath the silence, tension lingered, fragile, unspoken but deepening with each hour. Russell felt it coil around him like a rope. He knew the town would not leave them in peace for long, and as he watched over them, he realized his life, once untethered, was already bound to theirs. When the wind shifted, he thought he heard distant hooves, or perhaps only the restless rhythm of his own heart, waiting for what was bound to come. Isidora's strength returned in fragments, like shards slowly fitting back together, still fragile but forming something whole. By the third day, she managed to rise, though her steps faltered. She stood near the window, shawl drawn firmly around her shoulders, staring across the prairie as if gauging how far she might walk before exhaustion forced her back. Russell observed from the hearth, where he repaired tack, saying nothing, but glancing up long enough to remind her she was not alone. Nora clung to her mother's skirts, one hand tight in the fabric, the other clutching her doll. She was quieter than before, as if afraid even the smallest sound might invite trouble once more. When Isidora faltered, Russell rose and steadied her arm. She recoiled at his touch, then allowed him to guide her back to the chair near the fire. Her whisper was weighted with shame. "I should not be a burden." "You're breathing," he replied evenly, his words neither comfort nor reproach, but stated as fact. "That alone proves you belong." The remark startled her, and she turned her face away, heat rising beneath the bruises on her skin. She gave no answer, but Nora's gaze shifted toward Russell, a spark of trust appearing in her small eyes. Later, when Isidora tried to step into town in search of work, Russell walked beside her. The main street buzzed with wagons rattling, men driving cattle, and women hanging laundry across porch lines. Yet the air grew strained as glances followed them. Voices carried on the breeze, hushed but sharp. That's her, the debtor's widow. Nearly destroyed and still shameless enough to walk here, she'll bring that cowboy down just as her husband did himself. Each word made Isidora stiffen. Her grip on the shawl tightened, her eyes lowered to the dirt. Russell's stride remained, steady, his presence a shield that turned jeers into whispers. He carried no weapon, but the sight of him at her side kept malice at a distance. At the mercantile, she spoke carefully, her voice shaking. I could scrub floors, or sew. Anything, to repay what is owed. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a narrow smile, slowly shook his head. Debts aren't cleared with a needle or a mop. Folks remember what's left unpaid. His eyes flicked toward Russell with a half-smirk. You'll waste your coin on her. Russell set flour and beans on the counter, coins laid firmly beside. Them? His silence heavier than argument. When they stepped outside, Isidora's breathing was uneven, her shame visible in the rigid line of her shoulders. On the walk back, she finally murmured, They're right, I'm nothing but a stain on anyone who helps me. Russell stopped, forcing her to meet his gaze. His voice was low but edged with steel. A man's true mark is how he treats those without strength. You've carried enough of other men's sins, you won't carry mine. She blinked quickly, unable to meet his eyes, though the heaviness in her chest eased a little. The grip of shame began to loosen. At the cabin, Russell started showing Nora how to ride the small pony that grazed in the pasture. Her laughter came faint and uncertain at first, but grew stronger as the pony carried her around the yard. Isidora stood in the doorway, a hand resting against her lips, watching her daughter sit more confidently in the saddle. A gentle warmth spread through her, one she dared not name for fear it might fade like smoke. That evening, with the fire casting golden light on the cabin walls, Nora slipped from her blanket and climbed into Russell's chair. She tucked her knees under her chin, her doll pressed close, and whispered, Will you always protect Mama? Russell studied her face, the fire reflected in her wide eyes. He gave a slow nod, not a grand promise, just a quiet vow that settled in the room, like a stone sinking into deep water. Nora leaned against him, letting out a soft sigh as if a burden had been lifted from her small shoulders. The peace was short-lived. Word reached Russell that riders had passed through town, debt collectors who claimed Isidora belonged to them. Their threats spread quickly. What she owed would be taken one way or another. The townspeople listened, some with pity, most with grim approval. Debt was its own mark of disgrace. A woman without a husband carried no shield. One evening, as Russell returned from the pasture, he found Isidora standing by the fence, looking out toward the horizon. The fading light softened her bruises, though her face bore new lines of fear. She spoke without turning. They'll come. You shouldn't be caught in this. Let me go before it ruins you too. Russell stepped closer, steady as the ground beneath her feet. If you walk out there, you'll face them alone. Is that what you want your daughter to see? Her throat tightened. She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. I don't want her to see me disgraced. He lifted his hat slightly, meeting her gaze. Then let her see you stand, not alone. For the first time, her eyes lingered on his face, searching, tired but drawn. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then Nora's voice called from the cabin door, breaking the moment. Isidora turned quickly, brushing her cheeks. That night Russell sharpened his knife by the fire, steel rasping against stone. Isidora sat by the hearth, mending a tear in Nora's dress, while the child hummed softly. The cabin felt too small, for the weight pressing in from beyond, yet it pulsed with a fragile sense of home, as if daring the world to take it away. Then the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of distant hoofbeats across the prairie. Russell paused, the blade catching. The firelight. He listened, eyes narrowing, then returned to his task. Isidora caught the shift in his expression, her hands pausing over the cloth. Neither said a word, yet both understood its meaning. The horizon seemed to press closer, carrying with it the weight of judgment. Firelight wavered, shadows sliding across the wooden walls. Nora drifted into sleep, her head resting on her mother's lap. Russell placed the knife aside, his eyes fixed on the door, as though already bracing for the inevitable knock. The night was still, save for the whisper of silence, but one thought lingered between them. When that time arrived, would their bond endure? The saloon reeked of whiskey and sweat, lantern light swaying against the smoke-heavy ceiling. Russell stood at the bar, hat brim shading his eyes, hands resting loose at his sides. He had come only for water and supplies, yet the low hum moving through the crowd signaled the night would not remain quiet. Across the room, 3 men lounged together, boots propped on a chair, spurs catching the light. Debt riders, dust-stained coats, voices sharpened with cruelty. One rose slowly, walking forward with a grin that carried no kindness. "You're the cowboy who took in the debtor's widow," he said loud enough for all to hear. "Strange thing to chain yourself to." Russell sipped his drink, setting the glass down with measured calm. "She doesn't belong to you," laughter burst out. Another man stood, taller, a scar cutting across his cheek. "Everything about her belongs to the debt. That includes her, and anyone who shelters her. Owes twice over." The room hushed, conversations fading like candles snuffed out. All eyes locked on Russell, waiting to see if he would bend or stand firm. At last he turned, voice low but steady. "No one lays hands on her again. Not while I live." "The first," man sneered. "Bold words, cowboy, but words won't clear her dues." Russell's jaw tightened, though his face remained controlled. "Debt is a burden on a man's shoulders, not a claim on a woman's body." The taller rider spat on the floorboards. "Think you can stand against all of us? Against this town?" Russell answered only with silence heavy as iron. The barkeep polished the counter, his eyes never leaving the standoff. At length the riders muttered among themselves and backed away, but one leaned close as he passed. "This isn't finished. She'll be ours again, one way or another." When Russell rode back, the prairie glowed silver beneath the moon, the stillness almost too quiet. Inside, Isadora sat by the fire, needle idle in tangled thread. She looked up as he entered. "You spoke for me." He set his hat down. "They won't touch you." Her lips trembled, a bitter half-smile forming. They already had. Words had stripped. "Me bear, you cannot understand the weight of it." Russell crouched beside her, the fire painting his face with flickers of shadow and gold. "I know this much. You're alive. And every breath you take weakens their hold." She shook her head. "I've been marked. A woman beaten in the street does not rise again. People remember disgrace longer than they remember wounds." He studied her carefully before answering. "Then, let them remember. The shame lies with the one who strikes, not with the one who endures." Her chest tightened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to silence the sob threatening to break loose. Nora stirred in her blanket, mumbling softly, unaware of the storm filling the room. Days passed, each one heavy. Isadora fetched water, her posture steady, though her eyes stayed lowered. Neighbors whispered. Children stared until pulled away. Yet Russell walked at her side, his presence solid, his shadow long, a shield that no gossip could pierce. His silence itself was defiance, refusing to let her disappear into nothing. But the riders did not stay gone. On the fourth evening, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Nora gasped from the doorway, clutching her doll. Isadora froze at the table, her hands white-knuckled. Russell stepped outside, dusk settling hard across his face. 3 men waited at the gate, their horses restless, breath steaming in the cool air. The leader leaned forward. "We've come for what's ours." Russell's voice was calm, edged with steel. "Turn back." The man's hand hovered near his holster. "She owes. She owes nothing." The tension stretched taut as wire. The prairie wind hissed, carrying dust and sweat. Then Nora's voice broke through, small and trembling. "Leave my mama alone." Cruel laughter erupted. Isadora stumbled forward, pale but fierce, placing herself between the riders and her child. "If it's me you want, then face me. Don't steal her innocence to pay a debt you invented." Russell stepped beside her, shoulders squared, his hand not on his gun but resting calmly at his side, eyes fixed on the riders. "You've seen what happens when men push too far. Don't test how far I'll go." For a moment, the night held its breath. The leader studied him, weighing the silence, the steadiness. At last, he spat into the dirt. "This isn't finished. We'll have her or you'll bury her yourself." With that, they wheeled their horses and vanished into the dark. Dust settled slow and heavy. Isidora's knees gave out, and she clutched Russell's arm to steady herself. He held her firm, unshaking. Nora ran to her mother, burying her face in the torn dress. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow fragile. Isidora held her daughter close, whispering comfort, though her own voice shook. Russell stood near the door, eyes on the horizon, muscles taut, knowing the riders would return. Yet something had shifted. Isidora had stood, even while afraid. Nora had spoken, and Russell had not moved an inch. For the first time since her world had broken, Isidora felt a thread of dignity weaving through the ruin. The night's silence no longer felt empty. It carried the echo of an unfinished battle, along with the fragile promise that when it returned, they would face it together. The cabin remained quiet, the fire's soft crackle giving breath to the stillness. Outside, the prairie slept beneath a wide sky of stars, yet inside the air was heavy with unspoken truths. Isidora sat at the table, a needle between her fingers, though the thread hung loose, forgotten. On the rug, Nora had drifted into sleep, her doll clutched tightly, her peaceful rest a thin shield against the weight of night. Russell leaned in the doorway, his hat set aside, his gaze following the firelight as it softened the lines of Isidora's tired face. She looked up at him, lips parting as though to speak, but silence held her. Shame lingered at the edges of her voice, a shadow she could not outrun. Finally, she whispered, "I've brought you nothing but trouble." He stepped closer, floorboards creaking under his boots, his tone low but steady. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost." Her eyes glistened, torn between doubt and fear. "How can you say that, after what they've done? After how people see me?" Russell knelt beside her, filling the space with his quiet presence. His rough hand covered hers, not forcing her eyes to meet his, but letting the warmth of his touch say what words could not. "I've walked this land, alone too long. I thought silence was all I had. Then you and that little girl showed me it doesn't have to be that way." Isidora's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, yet the scars within her whispered otherwise. "I don't know if I can be whole again." His thumb brushed across her hand, slow and deliberate. "You don't need to be whole, Isidora, you just need to be." The words loosened something inside her, breaking the weight that had pressed on her chest since the day of her beating. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from despair, but from release. She turned to him, meeting his eyes at last, and found no judgment, only steady kindness that held her firm. Russell's voice dropped to a whisper, yet it carried the strength of a vow. "I'll be gentle with every step if you'll walk beside me." For a moment, she only stared at him, firelight painting his face in gold and shadow. Then, with trembling breath, she nodded. "Yes." Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a simple silver ring, one kept from his mother's belongings never before given. With reverence, he slipped it onto her finger, as though crowning her a queen. The metal caught the firelight, glinting soft but certain. She leaned her forehead against his, her tears damp against his cheek, whispering her vow in return. "I'll walk with you." The fire burned low, the night folding its hush around them. Outside, the world remained harsh and unyielding, but within those walls a covenant had been made. They were no longer three souls merely surviving. They were bound not by display but by quiet defiance of despair. Love does not always come with thunder or trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in vows spoken by fading fires, when two wounded hearts choose to heal together. Now tell me, from where are you listening?